And I'm going to plug you in so that students can see you on the big screen.
Sounds good.
So the last time we talked with students was, believe it or not, I looked it up, it was 7 years ago in 2012 on Halloween. And a lot has changed, but first I want to introduce you to everybody. Cory Doctorow, as we've talked about, is an activist, an internet scholar, a science fiction author. And how do you describe yourself these days?
I say all of those things, pretty much. Author, activist, journalist, yeah, pretend academic. I've got a 4 universities, never got a degree, but I have an honorary one. Stay in school, kids!
We've talked a lot about the internet and culture as it exists today. I'm wondering, from your perspective, if you can share with us a little bit about how you've seen it go over the years. When you and I were in high school, we were about a year apart, and when we were in high school, we had the Mentor publishing things like Conscience of a Hacker. We saw the Howard Rheingolds of the world come up and talk about virtual community, open software development. Where are we now, and what do you think this means for young people as they try and figure things out for themselves?
So I think maybe the most productive way to answer that is to talk about the evolution of my thinking on it. So there was a time when technology was not thought of as something that was a big business. At best, it was thought of as something that might become a big business. And it was really about hobbyists who had a view that was really widely seen as being like overly optimistic, that someday everybody would want to use a computer. You know, famously, the CEO of the Digital Equipment Corporation, which is a company that's out of business now that used to make big corporate mainframe systems, said that he thought that someday the world might need as many as 6 computers, right? And Bill Gates, you know, out of Microsoft, said there's just no reason to build powerful computers for home users. He said no one has any use for more than 512 kilobytes of memory. So to understand what that means, so a kilobyte of a memory, 512 kilobytes of memory is half of a megabyte of memory. A megabyte of memory is 1,000th of a gigabyte of memory. Your phone probably has 64 gigabytes, so that is 1/128,000th of the power that your phone has. And Bill Gates said no one will ever need more memory than that. So, you know, pretty clearly, even people in the industry used to think of this as being a fringe phenomenon for weirdos, right? It was about as like mainstream as, say, like LARPing. It wasn't really like a hobby that everyone was into. And then over time, it became more professionalized. It became more of a business. Around 2000, there was this huge, crazy bubble where people were just investing in every weird idea that involved the web. And there were just, like, literally millions of new websites every day. Not like new people signing up for online services, but people inventing new online services. So it wasn't like there were a million new Twitter users or TikTok users every day. There were thousands of new things like TikTok and Twitter popping up every single day. And a lot of them were really ridiculous. I raised some money for a software company in those days, and I remember the people we raised it from boasting that they had just invested in a company called Cab Candy. And Cab Candy was somehow had to do with the web, but its primary thing was they would give taxi drivers candy that they could sell to people who rode in taxis. And that was somehow a website, and they raised millions of dollars to make Cab Candy, which, needless to say, doesn't exist today. So it was this very exuberant, weird moment. But one of the things about that moment is that almost no one had had a formal education in tech. And so there was this sense then that making technology was a thing that you did because when you used a computer, it somehow spoke to you. And it made you excited. And it didn't matter if you had a computer science degree or an electrical engineering degree. What mattered was that you were excited. You could learn the rest on the job. And there was so much money sloshing around with all these companies that were starting. And they needed people so badly that if you showed up and said, I just love technology, they'd be like, great, we'll train you, here's a job. And so there are people from lots of different backgrounds who are getting jobs in tech, and it meant that tech was like weird in a way that's kind of hard to explain today. Maybe the closest thing would be like, who is it that gets to be a TikTok star? You get to be a TikTok star if you have a weird idea for a thing to do with TikTok that other people are like, hey, I found that interesting. I'll watch that person do that thing on TikTok. It's not that you like got a degree in TikTok production and went to work for one of the big 5 TikTok houses and they mentored you through a TikTok executive program that made you into a TikTok star. You're a TikTok star because you've just got a weird idea. A bit like YouTube was 5 years ago. And over time, what's happened is not just that the people who work in tech have become professionalized, but over the same period, the number of tech companies that just exist has gone down and down and down. There's a software developer from New Zealand named Tom Easton who tweeted this thing that I think about all the time. He said, I'm old enough to remember when the web wasn't just 5 giant websites filled with screenshots from the other 4. Right? And that's, like, I look at the web today and that's what it feels like. And I know that sounds like a grumpy old man saying, get off my lawn. But there is a difference between the feeling 20 years ago that technology wasn't just something that anyone could make, but that if you made it, it would be one of many different services, this like huge, diverse, weird, amazing place where things just popped up every day that just were interesting and scratched someone's itch, and you were like, I don't understand, you know, that's a weird flex, but like, you do you, baby, like, you want to put a fishbowl on a webcam and invent webcams so that you can streamline video of fishbowls? That's your thing, man, and you go and you do it, like, that's, you know, so long as you're not hurting anyone else, we love your weird web stuff. And that weird web, it exists, but it exists inside these like big services that are owned by a few companies. So that was kind of my journey. And, you know, if you'd asked me like 4 years ago, I would have said, okay, that's what's going on with the web today, is that the whole web is just like 5 companies now, plus like 3 companies from China and 2 from Russia. But today what I would say is that the web experienced the same thing that everything else experienced. Because 40 years ago, when tech was starting, when the first Apple computer was made, we had a change in our politics, starting with the election of a guy named Ronald Reagan, who decided that the rules that America used to use to stop companies from becoming monopolies, from growing so big that they could stop new companies from competing with them, that those rules didn't need to be enforced anymore. And so tech was like the industry that started just as we stopped enforcing these anti-monopoly rules. But every other company eventually caught up with them. So it's not just tech that's like 5 giant companies. Like, are any of you into pro wrestling? Anyone? WWE?
Any pro wrestling fans?
A couple who are almost ready to admit it.
Okay. So I'm not a big pro wrestling fan, but like 40 years ago, there were 30 different wrestling leagues. There's one wrestling league today. It bought all the other ones. That used to be illegal, right? Companies weren't allowed to buy their competitors. Right? Like, Yahoo wouldn't have been allowed to buy Flickr, or Facebook wouldn't have been allowed to buy Instagram, or Google wouldn't have been allowed to buy YouTube back when we had rules against monopoly. So this one company, this company called WWE Wrestling, run by this like evil billionaire named Vince McMahon, he bought all the other wrestling leagues. And now all the wrestlers have to work for him. And he reclassified them. They're not employees anymore. Now they're contractors, so he took away their health care. So these people, like, get beaten up in a ring all day, and they're all dying in their 40s and 50s because they have no health insurance, right? So that's wrestling. It used to be 30 companies, now it's 1, right? Eyeglasses. Do any of you wear eyeglasses? I wear eyeglasses. Take your glasses off, wave them in the air, and squint at me if you wear eyeglasses. Okay, so, like, it doesn't matter what it says inside your glasses, if it says Bausch & Lomb, or if it says Dolce & Gabbana, or if it says Versace, or if it says Oliver Peebles, or if it says any other eyewear brand. Every single eyewear brand that you've ever heard of, except for a couple of ones that sell on the internet, every single one of them is now owned by one company. It's an Italian company called Luxottica, They also own every single eyewear retailer, right? So they own Sunglass Hut, and they own Lens Crafters, and Sears Optical, and Target Optical. And when eyewear companies won't sell to them, so like Oakley said, no, we're not going to sell to you, we're good. They're like, fine, we just don't sell Oakley products in any of the stores where people buy glasses. And a year later, Oakley hasn't sold any glasses for a year. They're about to go bankrupt and Luxottica bought them. So it's not just that tech has become really concentrated, kind of boring, and owned by like a half dozen executives whose decisions get to like determine what all the rest of us do. It's everything, right? But my wife works for Disney. I live in Burbank, so like I can walk to Disney, Universal, and Warner, all their headquarters. That big water tower in all the Warner Brothers movies, that's down the road for me. Disney just bought Fox, right? They want 5 movie studios, which, again, 40 years ago there were 30 movie studios. Now there's 4 movie studios, right? There used to be 50 talent agencies here in Hollywood. Now there's 3. And all of the Hollywood screenwriters, every screenwriter in Hollywood has been on strike since last April. They all fired their agents last year because these 3 companies, because they're the only people that you can have represent you if you want to be a screenwriter, they've all said, we're going to accept less money for the writers if the studios will give us more money for ourselves. So they're supposed to be like your guy fighting your corner, going in and going like, my guy's not going to write that TV show unless he gets so many dollars. And then the studios are like, I tell you what, I'll give him half that, but I'll split the difference and give you the rest. And they're like, sounds good to me, right? So since April, every screenwriter has been on strike against every talent agency. No one has got an agent in Hollywood anymore. It's the first time that's ever happened in the history of the industry. And so I guess what I'm trying to get at here is that the change that we've seen in technology, it's not a technology change. It's a global change that has taken place in the energy sector, in banking, in screenwriting, professional wrestling, eyeglasses, construction materials, you name it, right? Like there used to be 30 companies making tractors. Now there's 2, right? So if you're a farmer, now you've got 2 choices, right? Same with cars. Same with luxury brands, right? Like Tiffany, the guys who make the diamond necklaces, are now owned by the company that owns Moet & Chandon, the champagne maker, and also like 10 other luxury brands. It's all just one company, right? So that has been a huge change. And what it means is that it's harder to have a cool, weird idea and start it. And it's harder if you work in the sector to get a good deal from your employer because there's fewer employers. And if you say, I don't like the offer that you've got, they're like, okay, well, try and get a better offer from someone else. There's only 3 of us. We all have the same deal, right? It means that by and large, things are just more abusive, right? Like we get spied on so much more by our technology, not because technology execs back then weren't evil. They were totally evil 40 years ago, but they were scared that you'd go to someone else if they spied on you. Now they're like, where are you going to go, right? Like, you're going to leave Facebook? Fine, we'll see you on Instagram. We own them too, right? So we've become trapped in walled gardens, and when we escape the wall, we find ourselves in a bigger walled garden. And if we get out of that one, we find ourselves in a different walled garden. And that, I think, is the biggest change that technology has undergone in the last 40 years.
Well, thank you for the synopsis. And now that you've cheered us up,
yeah, really.
One of the things that you and I have always agreed on is this balance between accountability in the bigger picture, and I saw your post about KPMG this morning, and personal liberty. And the reason I teach the way that I do, and that I'm now extending that further than my own classroom, is because nowhere has the monopoly been more historically powerful than in education. It happens to people before they have the psychological boundaries to say no. It is up to an increasingly fewer number of publishers and testing corporations. You and I both have kids about the same age. When I teach, I place a premium on choice, informed choice. And my hope is that by connecting with a personal passion, by still using those corners of the internet where we can meet people and informational resources to build the networks and the ideas and the sense of ourselves that will contribute some sort of value. How do you see, I've talked with Brian Bellendorf and Tim O'Reilly about using the term open source to describe what I do, and we're philosophically aligned. If all of this economically and politically, because you're also talking to a room full of people that has some personal experience with ICE and xenophobia, if all of this in the big picture is sort of like the car that's driven off the pier, where do you see the air pockets that we can still draw enough breath to live to fight another day and see if maybe we can make it a positive impact and change things for the better?
Yeah, I'll tell you what gives me hope, because, like, as you say, that's a totally depressing opener. I'm sorry to be such a downer. And what gives me hope is this idea I got from this guy at Duke University named James Boyle, he's a lawyer who studies the history of copyright law. And he says that the environmental movement is a really good example of how things how change can be made. And he says that there was a time when we didn't have the word environmental movement. We didn't have the word ecology. And instead we just had people who cared about stuff. So some people would be like, I need to save these owls. And other people would be like, have you heard about what's happening to the whales? And some people would be like, the ozone layer's got a hole in it. Or tailpipe emissions are making the air too bad to breathe. But when you think about it, if you were like a Martian looking through a telescope at the Earth, and you're like, are people who are worried about tailpipe emissions, should they be fighting like on the same team as people who are worried about whales? Like, are those two issues related? It's not totally obvious from the outset why people who are fighting about whales should also think of themselves as being on the same side as people who care about tailpipe emissions. That like, they both seem like perfectly good things, but the idea that that they're both part of the same movement, it's not immediately obvious. And so what happened was, you had people who cared about whales and people who cared about tailpipe emissions, and they were all kind of isolated, and there weren't that many of them. So some people were fighting about whales and some people were fighting about tailpipe emissions. There weren't enough people in either group to either save the whales or reduce tailpipe emissions. And then the word ecology came along, and the word environment, and the environmental movement. And what they said is that what unifies everybody, right? What makes us part of the same fight is that we all care about the health of the earth and the living things on it. And caring about the earth and the living things on it means that if you care about whales, you really should be on the same side as the people who care about tailpipe emissions. Not because whales are going to choke to death on tailpipe emissions, but because they're both part of this bigger fight, which is being good stewards of the planet Earth, right? Now, I think we're at a moment like this for caring about the way that power is distributed in our society, right? You may not wear glasses, and so you may not care that the price of glasses has gone up tenfold in the past 10 years, right? Glasses cost 10% of what they do now 10 years ago before Luxottica bought all the eyewear companies and jacked up their prices, right? But you may care a lot about the fact that this professional wrestler that you grew up watching and who you love dearly is on GoFundMe every day begging people to send him pennies so he doesn't die because he doesn't have health care, right? Well, you may not care about either of those things, but you may want to have a website where white nationalists don't hound people of color and women for existing in the world and argue that they should be exterminated, right? Or you might care that you're a farmer and you can only buy seed from Monsanto now. And when you buy your seed from Monsanto, you have to buy it with an app that controls your tractor, and you can't use your tractor the way you want while you're using Monsanto seed, right? So all of those things, all of those different groups of people are all fighting the same fight. They're fighting a fight for two things. One is pluralism, and pluralism is the idea that power is in lots of hands, not just a few people's hands. And then the second piece is self-determination, the right to make up your own mind about how the technology that you use should work. So technological self-determination and pluralism unites every one of those different fights. And I think that while the number of people who care about how many websites there are isn't big enough to make a difference, and while the number of people who care about how many eyeglass vendors there are aren't enough to make a difference, that when you weld those two groups together with the people who care about finance and screenwriters and how many pet food companies there are, and how many poultry producers there are, because there's only 2 now, and how many other kinds of businesses and industries there are. So once you get all of those people together and say, I got your back if you've got my back, that what we're fighting for is not diversity in poultry production, but pluralism itself, that maybe we can make a movement that's so big that we can make a real, deep, profound political change. A change as profound as the one that was made 40 years ago when we stopped caring about those things.
So along that line, and I'm going to float out a few terms that I'll unpack with students later on, it kind of blows me away that we graduate class after class in our K through 12 and higher education systems without even so much as a working definition of the word internet or a history, much less a technical understanding. I gave the students, you mentioned white nationalism, and I did a very innocent, I thought, definitional search using Firefox and DuckDuckGo, and we've talked a little bit about which tools are infused with which DNA. And I got an entry that had a quote. I was looking at a definition of the suffix ology, which every one of my students knows means the study of. But at the end of the entry, I think it was for dictionary.com or Merriam-Webster, it said that no ology or ism has ever helped humanity. And I thought, huh? And then I thought, like any distraction vulnerable internet denizen who doesn't have anything better to do, I clicked on it to find out why that was there. And there was a quote at the bottom of dictionary.com from the eugenics of marriage. And just the inclusion of that, we talked about sort of legitimizing and normalizing certain behaviors and ways of being with each other. If you were to devise a curriculum and help young people really get their hands around what this all is, means, and does, would it be dark patterns? Would it be adversarial interoperability? I heard you a few years ago in a talk in Berlin talk about the internet not as a toy or even a tool, but the nervous system of the 21st century. What exactly do we need to know and learn and teach while we're learning and teaching to get our arms around this stuff and advocate for ourselves?
Yeah. So, boy, that's a hard question. I think, it's such a moving target that what's more important than teaching a specific skill is teaching an approach, a critical approach to technology. And so there was just actually a great article on Gizmodo that was responding to a piece in the Washington Post. So campuses across America, university and college campuses, are increasingly using location tracking beacons. So they put these little Bluetooth sensors all over the campus, and it passively records which phones are where and figures out which students belong to which phone, and just tracks every student all the time, everywhere they go. And it's creepy, right? And there's all kinds of ways it can fail. Like if you have a creepy professor who's stalking his female students, he can use this to follow them around on campus, right? If you have a student who's a creep, they can break into the campus security and they can follow students around and know where they are and know who's alone and know where people go. And then more importantly, whose business is it who you're walking around the quad with or where you are? So this guy is a public interest hacker. He wrote a thing saying you probably shouldn't do this, but here's what I would do if I were in school today, and it would probably get me expelled and maybe arrested. And then he proceeded to lay out 20 ways of hacking the system, right? So it was you could spoof the beacons so that every person was reported as being in every place all the time, right? You could spoof the beacons to create a table of which professor students cut their classes most often and publish running tallies like championship tables of who's the most boring professor on campus whose students like to cut their classes. You could, then he came up with 20 of these, right? And he said, but you shouldn't do that because you'll get arrested or kicked out of both. And then what someone replied was, if I were a computer science professor, I would assign a project to devise the mechanism for this, right? It wouldn't be to do it. It'd just be to figure out how to do it. Is this secure? How secure is it? What are its failure modes? How can it how does the thing that makes us safe also put us in danger? because, the way that they pitch this is campus safety, right? Someone gets attacked on campus, you can see who was there. Well, that's true, but if you want to attack someone on campus, you can use it to figure out where they are. So, what are the trade-offs? And that kind of critical thinking, the kind that doesn't get you arrested, but does let you evaluate technological claims and argue intelligently about them by bringing facts and evidence into the discussion, is a very useful tool for anyone who plans to grow up in a world where computers are increasingly the determining factor about how they live their lives. And so there's a middle and secondary school version of this that I've often thought about. I've talked about it for years and years, which is that if you go to school in America, thanks to a law that was signed in by President Clinton, your school, if it receives federal funding, needs to have censorship on its network to stop you from looking at boobies, right? And so every click you make on your network gets sent to a company that claims to have divided the whole internet into boobies and not boobies. And if the click is for a website that it thinks has boobies on it, it just sends you a page that says this page is blocked, this website is blocked. Like, hands up if you've ever clicked on a link and seen a thing that said this page is blocked on your network. Yeah, maybe, yeah.
The ones who are raising their hands are the ones that are telling the truth.
Right, the rest of you should be clicking more links. The thing is that everyone who has ever been on a school network knows two things about this. First of all, there are a bunch of pages that aren't pornography or age inappropriate that are blocked anyway, right? That are blocked because they just can't figure out accurately how not to block stuff. And you think about it, like, let's be super charitable, right? Let's assume that these guys have the best judgment of anyone who's ever sat out to categorize the internet. And that they only make a mistake 1% of the time. So 99% of the time, if they sit and look at a website and say that's good for kids, then they're right. And 99% of the time, if they look at the website and say that's bad for kids, they're also right. Okay, so they're failing 1% of the time. So let's say charitably that there's 10 billion websites you might want to look at. That means that they have misclassified 900 million websites, right? So that's at a failure rate of 1%. So that's a lot of incorrect website classification for them to have made, right? Or no, sorry, 100 million. No. That's a lot of incorrect classifications for them to have made. And what that means is that if you're a student who believes that your mind will be harmed by looking at things that are age inappropriate, the fact that your school has paid money for this stuff doesn't mean you're safe. It also means that if you're a student who wants to look at something that they've accidentally classed as illegitimate, and the stuff that they class is not like not randomly distributed. They're way more likely, for example, to misclassify websites that have an LGBT theme or that relate to sexual health than they are to misclassify websites about ancient Greece, unless there are statues of ancient Greek people with their willies out, in which case they will, in fact, misclassify those too. And so you know that, like, on the one hand, you're going to be blocked for stuff that you really should be seeing that's important to your development as a student and as a citizen and as a person in the world. And you also know that you aren't being kept safe. Teachers know that the ground shifts underneath them. If you could bookmark a web page to show to your class at 9 in the morning, and when you sit down to show it to them at 1 in the afternoon, you get a message saying, I'm sorry, this page has been blocked. Right? And then the other thing that most students, I think, probably know is that if you want to see these websites that have been blocked on your network, it's not hard to figure out how. Right? Like defeating these filters is actually pretty easy. So if your school is thinking, well, we'll keep our students safe because once we buy this product, they won't be able to look at websites that are bad for them, they're just wrong. Right? Like, as a matter of fact, students just go and look at those websites. And so you have over-blocking, under-blocking, blocking of curricular materials, and you have a service that doesn't work as advertised. And that's the thing that I think most people, if you've ever thought about it for very long, you already know. But here's the last piece. which is that the companies that supply censorware to your school, they're not like mostly in the business of providing tools to schools. What they've really set out to do, most of them, is provide censoring tools for national governments, particularly oppressive governments in the Middle East and the former Soviet Union. That's their bread and butter. If you're like Saudi Arabia and you want to stop people from seeing web pages about democracy, you hire one of these companies. And they provide you with a category not of what's boobies and not boobies, but of what's threatening to the Saudi royal family and what isn't. And these companies, they're basically workmen. Right? They work for the most oppressive, torturing, murderous, anti-democratic regimes on Earth. And then they repackage that software to help American schools comply with this rule from the Clinton era and censor their network. And every click that you make gets sent to those companies. Every keystroke you make, in many cases, gets sent to those companies. So you have these companies that are charging your school district money for a product that doesn't work as advertised, that exposes you to surveillance by war criminals, that overblocks you and interferes with your education, that underblocks you and puts you at risk, and the kids know how to defeat. And so putting that together as a project, you could imagine that you would document instances in which you were overblocked and ask your fellow students to document that. You could create a form like a Google form or an independent, platform form that students could go and fill in if they were overblocked, so you could gather data on it. You could gather data when you're underblocked. What did you see that you wish you hadn't seen? You weren't expecting to see it. You clicked the link, you saw something that was definitely inappropriate that they failed to block. You can figure out how to use the Freedom of Information Act, which forces government agencies to reveal their secrets to you. And you can file Freedom of Information requests with your own school district to find out how much money they've given these companies. And you can research these companies' corporate histories to find out how dirty they are and in what way they're dirty. And you can package that all together and go to the PTA, go to the school board, go to City Hall, go to your local newspaper, and give them a presentation. Right? This is what our class did this year. We figured out how this technology works, how it fails, what we're spending on it, who's providing it, and what's wrong with that. And we want the grown-ups who are in charge of making these purchase decisions and sending money that we could be spending on textbooks or basketballs or better school lunches to these war criminals. We want you to know how that money is being spent, because you can't spend it wisely unless you understand how it's being spent. That is not something that should get you kicked out of school. It might, depending on how bad your school administrators are, but it shouldn't. It certainly won't get you put in jail, right? It will only document in a way that other people will find legible the foundational technological incoherence of the situation that you find yourself a prisoner of.
So thank you for that, Cory. You know, the term subversive has come up a couple of times in our conversation today, and I think it's easier to be subversive when the needle moves so far. It's almost like you're being a bad lemming. And when I start my classes, you may or may not remember this, but you know, the first day that I meet students in August, I usually say fuck a couple of times, and then I actually leave the room once they understand the choices so that they can make a decision without me looking over their shoulder, both of which are technically illegal. Now, my students are softly chuckling, but not so much that it will register on the microphone. When we have these conversations, I think it's important, you know, you said you do you, and another key part of open source learning is connecting students with people out there who have the real experience they want and need. I was a guinea pig last week and trained with a UFC fighter and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu champion. And yeah, exactly. I'll work out the kinks eventually. But he used the exact same phrase, you do you. And one of the hardest things for an adolescent in any generation is to figure out who that you really is, especially in this kind of an environment. So a couple of days ago, I posted on our course blog introducing you and asking students if they had any questions. And 2 or 3 of the students replied with questions about, why does Cory write what he writes? Because Pirate Cinema, Walk Away, Little Brother, all have a tinge of rebellion and subversiveness, but in a very positive, sort of life-affirming way. And as a dad who's writing with his daughter, I was also really curious, along with a couple of my students, about Posey the Monster Slayer. So I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the inspiration for your writing and what you hope to share through that medium.
Sure. So I often get asked if I'm optimistic or pessimistic, and I don't like the question because I think that optimism and pessimism, both species, is something you may not have encountered this idea yet, is this idea of fatalism. Fatalism is the idea that, like, what's going to happen is going to happen, and it doesn't matter what we do. So optimism is like, it's a way of saying, I don't think it matters what we do, things will be okay. And pessimism is a way of saying, I don't think it matters what we do, it's all going to be terrible. And for me, the most important thing about both of those statements is the belief that you don't think it matters what you do. I think what we do matters, right? I think that what we do matters a lot. And there's a kind of weird and esoteric but delightful example I'll give you of how to understand where human agency, like what we do, changes the world, and where the world is like going to go where it's going to go no matter what. I have a colleague, a wonderful science fiction writer named Ada Palmer. Yeah. And Ada, in addition to writing science fiction, she's a professor of Renaissance Italian history at the University of Chicago, where she teaches, her specialty is researching, sorry, I just got an awesome text. Can I just tell you about my awesome text for a second?
Yes, please.
Edward Snowden has just turned in the introduction to the reissue of Little Brother for this summer.
Oh, wow. Congratulations.
So that's my cool. Anyway, thank you. And so her specialty is how forbidden knowledge was passed around during the Inquisition, right, when they were, like, burning heretics. So it's like religious heresy, homosexuality, pornography, witchcraft. She's this, like, super awesome professor. She's everyone's favorite undergraduate history professor because what she does with her freshman class every year is she assigns them a 3-week-long live-action role-playing game, a LARP, where they reenact the election of one of the popes from the Renaissance, what was called the Medici's Pope, because the Medicis were this family that controlled Renaissance Florence, and, they would, like, assassinate people they didn't like, and they ran, like, the mayor and the lord and the head of police and the chief banker, whatever, they're all members of the Medici family. And they fixed things so that the Pope was friendly to the Medicis. Except the Pope is not elected by the Medici. The Pope is elected by cardinals, who are like officials that sit under the Pope. They're like the Senate to the president. And she assigns everyone roles of real historic people from Renaissance Italy. And she says, okay, you got 3 weeks. Do deals, stab each other in the back, make alliances, break alliances, I don't care. Decide who the final 4 candidates are going to be for the Pope, right? Which is how the selection actually worked in Renaissance Italy. And at the end of 4 weeks, she dresses everyone up like Renaissance Italians. She's got like a Google search bookmark for like theater companies that are going out of business and selling their costumes. So everybody dresses up like Renaissance Italians. And they hold like giant axes, halberds, and swords and stuff. And they elect a pope. And every year of the final 4, 2 are always the same. They're always the same 2 people from history. And 2 are always different. Because although some people are always going to be in the final 4, if you look at like the Democratic nomination, right? Like Joe Biden was always going to be on that stage, right? Some of the people are people that you don't expect to show up. They're people who are there because the people around them made a choice that made a difference. So like, I don't know, Andrew Yang is not someone I think, if you'd like gone to Vegas a year ago, and so I don't know when Yang put his hat in the ring, maybe 18 months ago, and you'd asked a bookie for odds on like Andrew Yang being a presidential contender in 2020. The bookie would have said, Andrew who? Right? It's like, he's just not a thing that the great forces of history determined would happen. He is there, and what he represents is the change that is possible when human beings make choices, regardless of the historical circumstances that those choices are made in. And how did Joe Biden end up on the ballot? How did those 2 Pope candidates end up in the final 4 every year? Well, they ended up there because of choices that people made the last time around, right? 20 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever. That's how they got there, right? So I believe not in optimism or pessimism, because I believe that we can make a difference by making choices, right? That we can act together and individually to change the world. And the reason I write the stories I do is not to make people optimistic about the future, nor to scare them into pessimism, but to inspire them to hope. And hope is the belief that although you can't figure out how to get from here to the place that you want to be, that you can't figure out how to get from here to a place that's closer. And that when you get to that place that's closer to where you want to be, that you will find another path that you can take that gets you closer still. And that inch by inch, step by step, sometimes maybe having to double back and go back down again because you've climbed to a peak from which you can't ascend any further, but it isn't as high as you want to go, that we can find our way to a summit. Right? And so that is that kind of underlying message of my work. And if it has another theme, it's that while it's cool to think about what technology does, it's way more important to think about who it does it for and who it does it to. And that if we figure out and call our attention to those questions, whose finger is on the button, not what happens when you push the button, that you will lead yourself to a better world. And that the thing that we should fight for is much less about how the system works and much more about who the system works for and and on whose behalf it works and who it treats as a chess token to be pushed around the board. So that's kind of the like why the work is structured the way it is. I suppose the Monster Slayer. Hang on a second, because I have the roughs here.
Oh wow!
Yeah, it's super cool. The illustrator is this guy called Matt Rockefeller. He's amazeballs. Here, hang on a sec. Let me find one of the yeah, this is a good one. This is Posey the Monster Slayer fighting off the werewolf.
Nice.
Get that framed up there. So the story is about a little girl who, she's got a room full of like cool girly toys, like dollhouses and like princess tiaras and like fairy wings. But she also likes hunting monsters. So she tears them apart and she puts them back together as monster killing weapons. And, during the night while her parents are asleep, she fights monsters. And every time she defeats a monster, her parents come into her bedroom and say, like, go back to bed, you're driving us crazy. And she doesn't tell them about the monster. She goes like, yes, Daddy, yes, Mom, and goes back to bed. And every time her parents come in, they're turning into zombies because they're not getting any sleep. And the last monster she fights is her parents, who are zombies, and she can't defeat them. And when they finally overcome her, they don't like Carolyn from what they tuck her into bed. They put her back to sleep. And my daughter, who is homesick from school today, it's a miracle she hasn't come into the room to ask me if she's allowed to use her phone yet, because she's not allowed to use her phone today while she's homesick. And she's been in every 15 minutes with a different argument about why she should be allowed to use her phone. My daughter has a ton of middle names. Her name is Posey Emmeline Fibonacci Nautilus Taylor Doctorow. And in the book, Posey the Monster Slayer has all of those middle names. And her parents, every time they come in, they add one more middle name. So they're like, Posey Taylor Doctorow, go to bed. Posey Emmeline Taylor Doctorow, go to bed. Posey Emmeline Fibonacci Taylor Doctorow, go to bed, and so on and so on. So you run into monsters when you run into middle names as well. And that's the gimmick of the book. It's been a long journey. I started writing it 8 years ago. And it turns out that getting a picture book published is hard. But it's being published by Macmillan, who published my novels as well. Their first, second imprint. They also did my book in real life. Right. A great graphic novel. Yep. And so, yeah, I'm really excited. And Matt, who did the artwork, just kiss.
It looks terrific. I can't wait to see it.
Yeah.
So, we operate on the school campus like Pavlov's dogs, and we'll have a bell ring in about 5 minutes, and some of the students will leave. We can continue, but before the bell rings, I want to know, now that you've had a chance to meet Cory and listen to him for a while, Have any questions come to mind that you'd like to ask directly before we shift into lunchtime? This is the part where they all contemplate how visible they want to present themselves and whether they speak up.
I understand. Well, I mean, and also, everything I've said is kind of boring and non-controversial, so I can understand why no one has strong feelings about it.
Well, you said boobies. I can't,
And willies.
Yes.
Although that might be a little too British. Maybe I should have said wiener.
Does anybody? Yes.
After writing books, like a regular book, like with words, why then translate it to graphic novel?
Did you hear the question?
No, I just need you to repeat it.
Okay, so after writing so many books, whether it's nonfiction, like Information Doesn't Want to Be Free, or whether it's fiction and science fiction, what led you to want to write a graphic novel or a children's book?
I actually got an idea for a children's picture. Well, so part of it was that I had a kid, right? And so suddenly I found myself reading tons and tons of picture books. So it just wasn't a genre I spent a lot of time with, since I myself was a small child. So, it re-exposed me to the genre and what's possible with it. That was part of it. And then I had a dream for a story for a picture book, which is not this. And I sent it to my agent, and they were like, that's a kind of weird and interesting idea. Let me talk to a couple of kids book publishers. None of them liked it, but at that point I was already kind of on the journey of pitching kids book ideas, so I sat down and wrote like 9 more, and they were like, oh, that's the one we like. And then graphic novels, I've always loved them. In real life, I was really lucky to have this amazing collaborator, Jen Wang, just brilliant, and who did all the heavy lifting. And so it was very easy for me. And I'm doing another one now that we'll be announcing next week. And I have a different collaborator, but they also seem very, very good, although I'm hoping to be more involved in this one. I'd written a little comic book stories before that, but not a full-length graphic novel.
So I'm wondering if I can get some personal advice. The last time I reviewed our video from 7 years ago, and one of the greatest pieces of advice you gave was to leave off your writing for the day in the middle of a sentence. And now I'm actively using that because Roman and Littlefield offered me a contract to write a book about open source learning. And thank you. And the manuscript is due in about 3 weeks, and I have about half the book left to write. It's a push. So I'm wondering what advice you have.
Well, the biggest part of my advice is that it shouldn't be like that. You shouldn't get crushed. Crunches are never great. I mean, they're always a sign that something went wrong beforehand, and so this is salvaging advice rather than advice for how to do it right. What I would say is, if you have a strong outline, you know how much you have left to write. You should be dividing what's left into daily work tranches. So if that's 3,000 words a day or whatever, then that should be your daily work tranche. And if need be, you break that into smaller pieces. So maybe that's 3 sessions a day, one when we wake up, one before bed, and one over lunch break when your students are out of the room. And you just hit that target. Turn everything else off, hit the target. Remind yourself whenever you get stuck that you can always revisit the words later. Remind yourself that you can't tell in the moment whether you're writing good words or bad words, that the only way to do that is to stick it in a drawer for a while and come back and read it again, because how you feel about what you're writing in the moment is more determined by things like your blood sugar and your anxiety level, which is going to be high when you're late on deadline, than it is about the objective quality of the work. So it's a very kind of cognitive behavioral therapy thing.
Yeah.
You understand that you're feeling the anxiety and you're feeling the self-doubt about the quality of the work, and you can't stop feeling that. But a part of you can say rationally, that may or may not be a feeling that relates to an objective reality, and there's no way for me to tell until the work is done. And so I have to do the work and then go back and find the weak places and fix them, not wait until I know exactly what the perfect things are to write, because the more late I get, the more anxious I'll be, and the worse I will feel about what I'm writing, regardless of its quality.
If you need to leave, go for it. We're going to continue for a few minutes. Part of the reason I wanted to ask that question out loud and have the students hear your answer is because last semester we talked about the art of the essay. And the students didn't know about Montaigne or the desire to be understood. And all of them associated the word essay with trauma. And not in a minimal way. I mean like shaking, like wanting to drop out, like crying, like real panic attack stuff. And it made me realize that for a lot of students who don't get brought up with books or with writing as anything joyful or imaginative or connecting, it's really hard, not because of cognitive issues or language acquisition issues, but it's emotional. And so I wanted to put myself out there. Nothing went particularly wrong with Rowman and Littlefield. They offered a contract and I accepted it and thought, if not now, when? And I had a lot of the material that I'd written for blogs and elsewhere. I just need to compile a lot of it. But it was also, I'm turning 50 and I wanted this done.
Right.
So it was not for the most literary of reasons on this project, but I felt like I didn't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good anymore.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good is a really important outlook for any kind of long project. There will be props in the quality of work over a long project, and also in your perception of the quality of the work. And the way to get out of those props is to work through them and then revisit them as need be.
Yeah.
If you really need to set your conscience to rest about whether or not the work, these words are the words that you are going to keep in the end, and you want to kind of get it out of your mind, then as you write the part that you think is weak, put a notation in square brackets, revisit this later, and then you can just move on. It's a bit like, I don't know if you've ever encountered the idea of using TK and FCK when you work.
No.
TK, they're all journalists things, and they're both, they're glyphs that don't appear in English words by and large, so you can search a document for them and make sure they're all gone before you publish it. So TK means to come.
Okay.
So, if there's a quote you're gonna drop in later, you write TK, and FCK means fact check. And what they do is allow you to write something that you're not certain about without having the mental overhead of having to keep track of it.
Mm-hmm.
You know that when you're done, you've marked out those spots, and it is remarkably good to have that mental space. And remarkably effective to give yourself that mental space, because having to remember a bunch of things, right? Oh, this is the part that I want to go back and think about later, and having to have that in your mind while you're working on the next part, it just uses up some of your available capacity to write the next thing, and so then you feel worse about the next thing.
Yeah.
And so now you're trying to remember to go back and revisit that, and eventually all the headroom has been consumed by kind of revision thinking and not composition thinking. And if you mark that stuff off, you can go back and revise it at your leisure.
Yeah. So we've covered a lot of territory today, and I know that the students are going to have a lot of follow-up questions about some of these things. In the meantime, do you still think, given the fact that we're operating in all of these corporate lobbies in the big few companies that seem to dominate social media and the internet in general, do you still see room for hope when it comes to using the internet to find the people and the information that may lead us to those jobs that don't exist or to those epiphanies about ourselves, but to some greater, grander tomorrow?
Yeah, I totally do. No, I think that, so the internet does two things incredibly well, and it always does them well, and it does them better with every year. So one is that it helps you find people with difficult to locate interests, right? So that's why people who are starting radical political movements use it, right? It's why Black Lives Matter use it. Not because the belief that Black Lives Matter is not widespread, but professing that belief was not common. And so it gave people a place to whisper it before they shouted it. See how many other people would shout it with them. It's not...
That came from here, and it got routed to the agriculture. Yeah, but so Debo just now gave it.
Okay, thanks.
He's like, oh, I have a book here.
Sorry, Cory, I was listening.
Yeah.
No problem. It's how you got like non-traditional gender identities and communities around them, and the validation that allowed that to proliferate and be a mainstream thing. And it's also how like white nationalists fund each other.
Yeah.
And it's also why advertisers like the internet. It's like really hard to sell a fridge, right? Most people, the median person buys fewer than one fridges, right? So like, how do you target fridge ads? You stick them on the side of a bulletin board. So finding people are the side of a highway. So finding people who like search for fridges, even if that only boosts your success rate from 0.0000001% to like 0.0001%, still like huge lift. Right? So the internet's really good at finding people, and it's really good at letting people collapse. Right? Pool their labor with less overhead. Right? So we lower the administrative costs of collaborative effort, which leaves more surplus for the effort itself. You know, wikis are a great example, so are search code repositories like Git, but there's lots and lots of examples.
Yeah.
You know, where they're like, you know, Archive of Our Own, that kind of accretive fandom fanfic canon is a good example of how, you know, people can collaborate across time and space without knowing each other with a low administrative overhead cost. You know, compared to, you know, like, so if you want to, if your students find another teacher or practitioner's document of a project that they did, which they use as their basis for participating, and then use the message board hanging off of that documentation to communicate not even with the person who made it, but with other people who are doing the same thing. They're able to collaborate in a way that in the real world would require so much administrative overhead. Right? Like commission slips, background checks, you know, just all kinds of stuff that would be taken out of the time budget that you have to do the project itself.
Right.
And so when you have a system that's better than ever at finding people to collaborate with, and better than ever at helping those people who found each other collaborate, then it does hold out the hope of transformative change, especially when combined with this current and our norm of understanding that pluralism is a value that's been lost in 40 years of neoliberalism, and that it's a shared value that crosses many different struggles. You know, worried about climate change? Well, really what you're worried about is market concentration in the energy sector. Like, without that, we wouldn't have climate change, because the evidence about climate change would have been clear and not confounded by the expensive doubt projects that were financed through the excess rents that the monopolists were able to command because they're in such a concentrated market.
Right.
You know, they were competing with each other. They wouldn't have had the leftover capital to fund climate change denial. Right. And we wouldn't all be in danger of losing everything, right? So we're all really on the same side here.
Yeah.
Don't quite yet, and I think we will.
Well, and I love what you said about finding affinity and connecting through. What I describe to my students is creating communities of support and critique. So, you know, I don't care what you care about, but I care that you care about it is part of it. And then I care that you've had the experience and the expertise to know when I'm on the right track or when my thinking needs to be upgraded. And as you were talking, I forgot to mention this, but I hadn't seen your website in a long time, and I smiled so big when I saw your picture because I didn't know that you knew Jonathan Worth. And
yeah, Jonathan from way back. Actually, I'm the one who taught him in the Creative Commons.
Oh, really?
He came up for a popular science magazine for a profile. And he was like, what's the profile about? And I told him, he's like, gosh, you know, I've been a commercial photographer for years, and I never really thought about it. That's what got him on his journey.
So, okay, well, that led him to me because I met him through the Phonar class that he was doing, and we got together through, I think it might have been Howard Rheingold that introduced us, but I wound up in London giving a talk at the Royal Academy of Geography, met with Jonathan, who introduced me to Laura Ritchie, and do you know Laura at all?
I know her a little, yeah. Small world.
Okay, yeah. So she and I collaborated with our students and wound up doing a live performance in Yosemite, which gets me to the trip slips part of your conversation, because there weren't any, because it wasn't a school thing. It was a family trip that I happened to be invited to along with 100 students and an international group of musicians.
That's terrific. How cool.
Yeah.
Great.
So we're continuing to hack this, and I just want to say how grateful I am for you. I know how busy you must be, and I'm really appreciative of the time. And now that you moved into my old backyard, I still come down to LA. I'll be down next week, and one of these days, when I'm done with the manuscript, I'd love to see if you have time for a drink or just to hang out.
Yeah, I'm in Toronto next week. It's not public yet, but my last book, Radicalized, is shortlisted for the National Book Prize in Canada. So we're doing all the events next week.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And I'm so happy to hear the news and to be with you when you got the news about Edward. That's really fantastic.
Yeah, well, I knew he was doing it, but he's 2 weeks late handing it in. So that was great. It was his PA signaling me to say, like, here's the paste bid. I love working with Ed. Here's the paste bid with your intro.
Well, I mentioned Howard. He was kind enough to write the foreword for my book, and I have to send him some stuff today so that I can get that back from him whenever he gets to it. So I'm looking to follow a little bit in your publishing footsteps, if not your literary ones.
That's excellent.
Yeah.
Well, you think Howard is my love.
Okay, will do. Corey, thanks again. I'll see you online, and then we'll make a time in the future. Okay, bye.
I'll see you. Thanks.